The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for the final time. After 22 years of faithful service to the crown, today would be his last day as a member of the Queen's Guard. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he fastened the brass buttons, each one polished to perfection despite the emotional weight of the moment. James had joined the Guard when he was just 18 years old, fresh from a small village in Yorkshire where his grandfather had filled his childhood with stories of honor, duty, and unwavering loyalty to the monarchy. His grandfather, William Mitchell, had served under King George VI and had instilled in James a deep respect for the royal traditions that stretched back centuries. The ceremonial changing of the guard was scheduled for 11 o'clock, but James arrived early, as he always did. He walked slowly through the familiar corridors, remembering countless moments from his distinguished career. He had stood guard during historic state visits, protected the royal family during times of national celebration and mourning, and had earned the respect of his fellow soldiers through his unwavering dedication and integrity as he made his way to his post. James noticed an unusual commotion near the main entrance. Queen Camilla was arriving for an unscheduled visit, accompanied by her personal staff and several new security personnel. The Queen Consort had been making more frequent appearances at the palace since the coronation, often bringing changes to long-established protocols that made some of the older staff uncomfortable. James took his position at the main gate, standing at attention with his rifle held precisely as regulations demanded. The familiar weight of his bearskin hat and the crisp morning air reminded him of thousands of similar mornings throughout his career. He watched as Queen Camilla's motorcade approached, her royal standard fluttering in the gentle breeze. The vehicles came to a stop, and Queen Camilla emerged wearing an elegant navy blue coat and matching hat. Her expression was serious as she surveyed the assembled guards and palace staff. James had interacted with her several times during official ceremonies, but today, something felt different about her demeanor. As she approached the entrance, Queen Camilla suddenly stopped and turned toward the line of guards. Her eyes scanned the formation before settling on James, who maintained his stoic expression despite feeling her intense gaze. She whispered something to her private secretary, a thin man with nervous eyes who nodded quickly before approaching James. "Sergeant Mitchell," the secretary said quietly. "Her Majesty requires that you kneel as she passes." James felt a cold sensation in his chest. In all his years of service, he had never been asked to kneel for anyone except during the most sacred ceremonies, such as receiving honors from the sovereign or during religious services in the palace chapel. The protocol for greeting members of the royal family was clearly established. A respectful bow of the head while maintaining military bearing. He looked directly at Queen Camilla, who was watching him expectantly. Her expression suggested this was not a request but a command. James felt the weight of his grandfather's teachings, the memory of every oath he had taken, and the pride of his uniform pressing down upon him. "Beg your pardon," Sir James replied to the secretary in a steady voice. "But that is not the established protocol." The secretary's face flushed red as he glanced nervously between James and Queen Camilla. Other guards nearby could sense the tension building, though they remained motionless at their posts. Palace staff members began to gather at a respectful distance, aware that something unusual was unfolding. Queen Camilla stepped forward herself, her voice carrying across the courtyard. "Sergeant, I am instructing you to kneel. This is not a debate." The moment stretched like an eternity. James could feel his heart pounding beneath his red tunic, but his training and principles held firm. He thought of his grandfather's voice telling him that a soldier's greatest honor was not in blind obedience, but in upholding the dignity of the institution he served. "Your Majesty," James said clearly, his voice carrying the quiet strength that had earned him respect throughout his career. "I have served the crown faithfully for 22 years. I have followed every protocol and regulation with pride. However, I cannot comply with a request that goes against established military tradition and the dignity of this uniform." Murmur rippled through the gathering crowd of staff members. Queen Camilla's face darkened with anger, her composed royal demeanor beginning to crack. She was not accustomed to being challenged, especially not in public, and certainly not by someone she considered beneath her station. "You dare refuse a direct order from your queen consort?" she said, her voice rising slightly. James remained perfectly still, his rifle held in the traditional position, his eyes focused straight ahead. "I serve the crown and the traditions it represents, Your Majesty. Those traditions include the proper protocols for military ceremonies and the respect due to this uniform and position." The tension in the courtyard was palpable. Other members of the guard watched from their positions, unable to intervene but clearly supportive of their sergeant's stance. Palace staff exchanged worried glances, knowing they were witnessing an unprecedented confrontation. Queen Camilla's private secretary stepped forward again, attempting to defuse the situation. "Perhaps we might discuss this matter privately," he suggested nervously. But Queen Camilla was beyond diplomatic solutions. Her authority had been questioned publicly, and she was determined to assert her position. "No," she said firmly. "This soldier will kneel now, or face the consequences of insubordination." James finally allowed himself to look directly at Queen Camilla. His eyes held no disrespect, but they also held no fear. "Your Majesty, I have always shown proper respect to every member of the royal family according to military protocol. I bow my head in respect, as is traditional. But I cannot and will not kneel unless it is part of an official ceremony where such an action is appropriate." The standoff continued, as more staff members and even some tourists beyond the palace gates began to notice the unusual scene. Queen Camilla's anger was evident, but so was James's quiet dignity and resolve. Colonel Richardson, the commanding officer of the guard, had been summoned and was approaching quickly across the courtyard. His arrival would either resolve the situation or escalate it to an entirely new level. James knew that his career, his reputation, and possibly his entire future hung in the balance of the next few moments. As the colonel drew nearer, James closed his eyes briefly and thought of his grandfather's final words to him. "Remember, boy, respect is earned through honor, not demanded through fear. Stand tall, serve faithfully, and never let anyone make you compromise the dignity that uniform represents." The confrontation was far from over, and James knew that whatever happened next would echo through the halls of Buckingham Palace for years to come. Colonel Richardson approached the tense scene with measured steps, his experienced eyes quickly assessing the situation. He had served alongside James for over 15 years and knew him to be one of the most reliable and principled soldiers under his command. The colonel also understood the delicate nature of royal protocols and the importance of maintaining both military dignity and royal respect. "What seems to be the issue here?" Colonel Richardson asked diplomatically, though he had already been briefed by his aide about the confrontation. Queen Camilla turned her attention to the colonel, expecting immediate support for her position. "Colonel, your sergeant has refused a direct order to kneel in my presence. This is completely unacceptable behavior from someone supposed to serve the royal family." Colonel Richardson looked at James, who remained at attention, then back at Queen Camilla.
Right.
"Your Majesty, might I respectfully inquire about the specific circumstances requiring this protocol? Our current military regulations specify the appropriate honors for different occasions." The question clearly frustrated Queen Camilla, who had expected unquestioning compliance. "I should not need to explain my requirements to anyone. The fact is that I have given an order, and it has been refused." James finally spoke, his voice respectful but firm. "Colonel, I have maintained proper military bearing and shown appropriate respect according to our established protocols. I offered the traditional bow of respect, but Her Majesty requested that I kneel, which is not part of our standard procedures for this type of encounter." A small crowd of palace staff had gathered at a respectful distance, including several senior household members who understood the gravity of the situation. Among them was Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, the deputy master of the household, who had served the royal family for over 30 years and had witnessed the evolution of many protocols and traditions. Mrs. Hartwell quietly approached Colonel Richardson and whispered something in his ear. Her message was brief but significant. This type of demand was unprecedented and went against decades of established military ceremony. Colonel Richardson nodded thoughtfully. He found himself in an impossible position, caught between supporting his soldiers' adherence to proper protocol and avoiding a confrontation with Queen Camilla, that could have serious political ramifications. Your Majesty, the colonel said, carefully, perhaps we might find a solution that honors both your position and our military traditions. Sergeant Mitchell has always been exemplary in his service and respect for the royal family, but Queen Camilla was unwilling to compromise. Her anger had been building since James first refused her command, and she saw any attempt at negotiation as further defiance of her authority. There is no need for negotiation, she declared. Either this soldier follows my instruction immediately, or he will face discipline for insubordination. I will not tolerate this behavior from someone paid by the crown to serve. James deeply, not because they threatened his career, because they seemed to reduce his decades of faithful service to a mere financial transaction. His service had never been about the modest military pay, but about honor, tradition, genuine respect for the institution of the monarchy. James thought about all the ceremonies he had participated in, all the state occasions where he had stood for hours in perfect formation, all the times he had been honored to represent the best traditions of the British military. He remembered meeting veterans from earlier generations who had served with the same pride and dignity he tried to embody every day. Your Majesty, James said, his voice carrying a quiet strength that made everyone present listen carefully. I have given my adult life to serving the crown. I have missed family celebrations, holidays, and personal milestones to be here when needed. I have stood guard in all weather during times of national joy and national mourning. I have done so with pride because I believe in the dignity and honor of this service. He paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts. But that dignity works both ways. This uniform represents something greater than any individual, including myself. When I put it on, I become part of a tradition that stretches back centuries, connecting me to soldiers who served with honor under every monarch. I cannot betray that tradition, even under pressure. Queen Camilla's face flushed with anger at what she perceived as a lecture from a subordinate. How dare you speak to me in this manner? Your job is to follow orders, not to give speeches about tradition. Colonel Richardson stepped forward, realizing the situation was escalating beyond control. Your Majesty, perhaps we might continue this discussion in private. I take full responsibility for ensuring that proper protocols are followed. But James knew that any private discussion would likely result in him being ordered to apologize and comply or face immediate dismissal. He had reached a point where his conscience would not allow him to retreat.
Colonel, James said, I request permission to speak freely.
This formal request created another moment of tension. In military protocol, such a request was typically honored, but given the circumstances, it could further inflame the situation. Colonel Richardson looked at James for a long moment, then nodded. Permission granted, Sergeant. James straightened even further, if that were possible, and addressed both Queen Camilla and his colonel. I have served faithfully and honorably for 22 years. Today was to be my final day of service before retirement. I had planned to leave with pride in my service and respect for the institutions I have served. He looked directly at Queen Camilla, his expression respectful but unwavering. Your Majesty, I mean no disrespect to your position or person, but I cannot kneel simply because I am ordered to do so when such an action goes against established protocol and military tradition. Respect must be mutual, even within a hierarchy. The crown deserves honor, but so does the uniform that serves it. The courtyard fell completely silent, except for the distant sounds of London traffic beyond the palace gates. Even Queen Camilla seemed momentarily taken aback by the quiet dignity and sincerity of James's words. Mrs. Hartwell stepped forward, breaking protocol herself. Your Majesty, if I may, she said quietly, Sergeant Mitchell is highly regarded by all members of the household staff. His service has been exemplary, and his respect for the royal family has never been questioned. Several other long-serving staff members nodded their agreement, creating an uncomfortable situation for Queen Camilla, who suddenly found herself opposed, not just by one soldier, but by multiple members of the palace community. The moment stretched on, with everyone waiting to see how the confrontation would resolve. James remained perfectly at attention, his rifle held with precision, his bearing unchanged despite the enormous pressure of the situation. Queen Camilla looked around at the faces surrounding her, realizing that her demand was not finding the support she had expected. The rigid hierarchy she had assumed would work in her favor was instead revealing a different kind of respect and loyalty built over years of mutual honor and shared service. Colonel Richardson finally broke the silence. "Your Majesty, might I suggest that we consider this matter resolved? Sergeant Mitchell has shown appropriate respect according to military protocol. And today being his final day of service, perhaps we might allow him to complete his duties with the honor he has earned." The suggestion offered Queen Camilla a way to end the confrontation without explicitly backing down. But it also represented a clear victory for James's principled stand. The decision she made in the next few moments would set a precedent for how such situations would be handled in the future. Queen Camilla stood in the palace courtyard, surrounded by palace staff, military personnel, and the unwavering figure of Sergeant James Mitchell. The weight of dozens of eyes upon her made the decision she faced even more difficult. She had two choices: continue to demand compliance and risk appearing tyrannical, or find a way to retreat while maintaining some semblance of dignity. The silence stretched for what felt like hours but was only seconds. James could hear his own heartbeat as he waited for the verdict that would determine not just the end of his career, but potentially set a precedent for how military personnel would be expected to interact with the royal family in the future. Finally, Queen Camilla spoke, her voice carefully controlled. "Colonel Richardson, I expect that all members of the Guard understand their duties to the royal family. However," she paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully, "I also recognize that military traditions have their own importance." The statement was not exactly a concession, but it was not a continuation of her demand either. Colonel Richardson immediately recognized the diplomatic opening and stepped forward. "Your Majesty, I can assure you that every member of the Guard, especially Sergeant Mitchell, holds the royal family in the highest regard and follows all appropriate protocols for showing respect." James remained at attention, but he could sense a slight shift in the atmosphere. Queen Camilla looked at him once more, her expression unreadable, before turning to her private secretary. "We have other appointments to attend to," she said curtly. "I trust that future interactions will proceed more smoothly." As Queen Camilla walked toward the palace entrance, she suddenly stopped and turned back. For a moment, James thought she might renew her demand, but instead, she did something unexpected. She gave him a slight nod, the kind of acknowledgement typically reserved for formal occasions. James immediately responded with the traditional bow of his head. Exactly as military protocol prescribed. It was a small gesture, but it represented a mutual recognition of respect despite their disagreement. After Queen Camilla disappeared into the palace, the tension in the courtyard began to dissipate. Staff members gradually returned to their duties, though many cast approving glances toward James as they passed. Colonel Richardson approached James, its expression mixing relief with concern. "Sergeant, that was either the bravest or most foolish thing I have ever witnessed in my 30 years of service." "Perhaps both," Sir James replied with a slight smile. The first break in his composure since the confrontation began. "Walk with me," the colonel said, and they moved away from the other guards to speak privately. As they walked through a quiet section of the palace gardens, Colonel Richardson shook his head slowly. "James, I have to ask, was it worth it? You could have ended your career in disgrace. You still might face repercussions." James looked thoughtfully at the ancient walls surrounding them, walls that had witnessed centuries of similar struggles between individual conscience and institutional authority. "Colonel, do you remember when we first met? I was a young corporal, and you told me that wearing this uniform meant becoming part of something bigger than myself. I remember. You said that the uniform demands excellence, but it also demands integrity, that we serve not just the crown, but the ideals the crown represents. Today I felt that kneeling on command, outside of proper ceremony, would have diminished both the uniform and those ideals." Colonel Richardson nodded slowly. "And if you had to do it again, I'd make the same choice, sir. Some lines cannot be crossed, even under pressure." As they completed their walk, Colonel Richardson stopped near the main entrance. "James, your retirement ceremony is scheduled for this afternoon. After what happened today, it will probably receive more attention than usual. Indeed, Word of the confrontation had already begun spreading throughout the palace and beyond. By afternoon, several news outlets had learned of the incident, though the official palace response was simply that all protocols had been properly followed. The retirement ceremony took place in the palace's main courtyard with more attendees than originally planned. Many long-serving staff members, fellow guards, and even some junior members of the royal household came to pay their respects as James stood for the final time in his ceremonial uniform. Colonel Richardson read a citation recognizing his 22 years of distinguished service. The words took on special meaning after the morning's events. Sergeant Mitchell has consistently demonstrated the highest standards of military bearing, personal integrity, and unwavering dedication to duty. When the official ceremony concluded, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Hartwell approached, carrying a small leather-bound book. "Sergeant Mitchell," she said formally, "this is a personal message from several members of the household staff." James opened the book to find dozens of handwritten notes from people he had worked alongside for years. The messages all shared common themes: respect for his integrity, gratitude for his service, and admiration for his principled stand. One note, unsigned but clearly from someone with intimate knowledge of palace operations, particularly moved him. "Today you reminded us all that true service means serving ideals, not just individuals. Your grandfather would be proud." As James changed out of his uniform for the final time, he reflected on the extraordinary day. He had begun the morning expecting a quiet end to his military career. Instead, he had faced the most challenging moment of his professional life and emerged with his principles intact. His phone had been buzzing with messages throughout the afternoon. Fellow veterans, current military personnel, and even some civilians who had heard about the incident were reaching out with support. Many shared their own stories of times when they had faced pressure to compromise their principles. That evening, James sat in his small flat near the palace, still processing the day's events. He had given up the security and routine of military life, but he had gained something perhaps more valuable: the knowledge that when tested, he had remained true to his values. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. He opened it to find Colonel Richardson holding a bottle of whiskey and wearing civilian clothes. "I thought you might like some company for your first evening as a civilian," the colonel said, as they sat together, sharing stories from their years of service. Colonel Richardson raised his glass. "To Sergeant James Mitchell, who reminded us today what it truly means to serve with honor, to the traditions that bind us together and the principles that define us," James replied. Outside his window, the lights of Buckingham Palace glowed. In the darkness, a reminder of the institution he had served faithfully for over 2 decades. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight, James Mitchell could rest knowing that he had honored both his grandfather's teachings and his own conscience. The story of his final day would become part of palace lore, told and retold among the staff as an example of quiet courage and principled service. It would remind future generations that true respect flows from mutual dignity, and that sometimes the greatest service comes not from blind obedience, but from standing firm in one's convictions. In the weeks that followed, James would receive job offers from several private security firms and even an invitation to speak at military academies about leadership and integrity. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came in a brief handwritten note that arrived a week later with the royal seal. It simply read, "Respect earned through honor, not demanded through fear. Well done, Sergeant." It was unsigned, but James suspected it came from someone who understood that the morning's confrontation had ultimately strengthened, rather than weakened, the traditions they all served. The palace grounds returned to their normal routine, but the impact of that morning's events continued to resonate. Staff members carried themselves with a renewed sense of dignity, knowing that their workplace was one where principles mattered and where standing up for what was right was respected, even when it was difficult. James Mitchell had ended his career not with a quiet fade into retirement, but with a moment that defined the very best of what military service could represent: courage, integrity, and an unwavering commitment to the ideals that make service meaningful.